Thank y'all for being here today. First, I want to turn it over to Keely Glover with Dominion Energy. Dominion is our gracious sponsor, presenting sponsor for the 2025 Summit, and this is our pre-summit keynote to kind of get you primed and ready. So, Keela, I want to send it over to you and get to provide a few welcome remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pardon my lateness. I Meeting rooms are at a premium over here, and I was like, oh, I'll just pop in a room, and all of my usual hangs were taken. So I am here and very appreciative to have this opportunity. As GP said, my name is Keela Glover. I work in the philanthropy department for Dominion Energy South Carolina. We are excited to continue our partnership with you all and to be the presenting sponsor of the Together SC conference. I have just joined philanthropy in May, but I have been with the company for 22 years, so I know a lot about our reputation as being great corporate partners with agencies throughout South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And I'm happy to continue to work with a lot of you and look forward to meeting even more of you as we continue to make South Carolina better together. So, welcome. I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say today to get us ready for the event in February. So, thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I'll turn it back over to you, GP.
Thank you. Thank you, Keela. We're very gracious for all of our sponsors, including Dominion, for their support of the summit. Speaking of the summit, this is our pre-summit keynote. If you were with us in 24, which is this year, although I have a habit of saying last year, because in my brain, we're in 25 summit mode. We had the pleasure of having Dr. Manuel Pastor with us as our keynote for day 2. With a really powerful message about South Carolina's growth and solidarity economics and how growth is impacting, particularly those around the community where we were, around North Charleston. And your feedback as attendees was so strong. We wanted to offer to get Dr. Pastor and his colleague, Dr. Benner, back with us to break open that conversation some more. There was a lot more to unpack with that and to digest. And so we are very grateful to have Dr. Pastor and Dr. Benner with us. If you haven't registered for the summit, we encourage you to do so. It is selling very well. In fact, about 40% of our seats have already been sold for the conference. It's in February 25th through the 27th in Columbia. We have a great series of keynotes. We have over 32 sessions, a lot of networking. Our keynotes this year obviously include Drs. Manuel and Benner, Dr. Pastor and Benner. And we kick things off, though, on day 1 with former governor and Nobel Peace Prize winner David Beasley, who received the Nobel Peace Prize for his work with the UN World Food Program. He will kick things off on day 1. Day 2, we have Drs. Pastor and Benner. We also have our local elected leaders panel featuring elected leaders at the local level, a mayor, a city council member, a county council member, and a school board member from across the state, all of whom have experience with nonprofits either as a staff member or as a very active board member in their community. That'll be moderated by Todd Glover, who is the CEO of the Municipal Association for the state. The theme this year in 25 is creating common ground. An apt theme for what we feel like nonprofits are doing all across our state and across our nation is helping create that common ground to support our communities. And that's one reason we wanted Drs. Pastor and Benner with us in 2025 to help us have the data and the perspective to make sure we are creating that common ground in an effective way. So with that, Drs. Pastor and Benner, I'm going to take a second. You can say, well, I'm going to put you in the pen, and Dr. Benner, feel free to share your screen. For the next 10 seconds, the screen may look a little weird while we get that situated, but I will turn it over to y'all. And you can, a little bit of housekeeping. Please feel free to throw questions in the chat along the way. Staff, we will kind of go through those and combine questions or complement them together, and Q&A will be towards the end. And we will pose those questions for our presenters. So feel free to do that. And with that, Drs. Pastor and Benner, I will give it to you.
Great. Well, thank you, GP. And thank you all for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Manuel and I are both in sunny California. I'm in Northern California, Santa Cruz. Manuel is in Los Angeles. And we're here to talk to you a bit about why mutuality matters, but also really looking forward to being in person with you in the end of February. Manuel and I have been working together for over a quarter of a century, and wanted to start a little bit by talking about what has prompted us to write this book, Solidarity Economics, and to really rethink how we understand our economy and what really drives our economy. We have 6 books together. We've gotten to the point where we can complete each other's sentences, and joke lines from all of our different jokes, the punchlines. But part of what we've done in those 6 years is really look at the ways that social equity and mutuality is actually good for our economy, not just good for people. But that all got sharpened a bit when the pandemic hit, COVID, because part of what it helped us understand, and again, in conversation with many of our community and nonprofit partners, is that we really needed to not just come up with a laundry list of good policies and incremental changes, but really needed to fundamentally rethink how we understand what works in our economy and what doesn't work. And part of that, of course, was sponsored by seeing how badly our country was hit by COVID, one of the highest incident rates of countries in the world, but also the racial inequality in it. Black, Latino in LA, Pacific Islander populations, particularly heavily hit. And that's, of course, an accumulation of lots of the social and economic determinants of health, but also in a context where our health insurance is tied to place of work. And then when people got laid off, of course, they lost their health insurance. But that crisis also illustrated our mutuality, that none of us could be free of threat from COVID unless we were all free, and needing to protect others was an essential way of helping to protect ourselves from the illness as well. But of course, it also showed our division, where some people couldn't wear a mask to protect others because of their concerns, and showed the incredible divisions in approaches in our society to how to respond to that crisis. But that crisis moment actually built on what we can see over a long term of many decades of challenges facing our country. And I'll turn that over to Manuel now to talk about some of those longer term trends that sparked our economic rethinking. Manuel?
Great, thank you. And thanks to South Carolina for bringing us back again. Yeah, I spoke last year, and then they said, can you speak again the next year? And I thought, damn, I better bring Chris Benner with me so there'd be a little spice and difference. And then we both heard there was a Nobel Peace Prize winner who will also be speaking. And so we're trying to step up our game through this preliminary period, and then certainly at the conference itself. So as Chris was saying, we've been thinking a lot about our economy for some time, and certainly the sort of issues of the power of mutuality and how when we take care of one another, we actually do better, not just as a society, but as an economy, but also how we exist. And it's so clear in this current year in a period of tremendous polarization and difference, and all that kind of got exacerbated by COVID, by the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning that and discussion about that took place after that murder. But it's been bubbling up for a long time. It's been bubbling up for a long time because, number one, the country's demography has been changing. And you could see here that the US is slated to become majority people of color, majority minority, majority non-white by about the year 2045. And that is something that has caused some fear on the part of some in the United States about a nation slipping away on them. It's caused some delight in other parts of the United States where the virtues of food from every part of the world seem like that's a good thing to have. But it's actually been an unsettling thing for the country and helped to prompt some of the polarization and division that's taken place. What is interesting is that this is uneven. So California, for example, where we live, became majority people of color by about 1999. Next slide. South Carolina, where you live, much slower demographic change. In fact, projected to basically have a growing Latino population, a slightly shrinking white population, but basically not as much change as in the rest of the country. But still, this specter of change in the country does impact the way we think about things politically, in part because of the way in which immigration, a hot button issue in his last election, has been playing out. Now, what's interesting is that while there's been a lot of political noise about immigrants, the share of the United States that's actually foreign born, while it grew relatively rapidly between 1990 and about 2008, going from about 8% of the US to about 12.5%, it's been really growing at a very glacial pace since. So, second set of nearly 20 years, it only went up by about 1 percentage point. What has happened has been a reallocation of where immigrants are. We live in California. In the 1970s and the 1980s, fully half of all the immigrants coming into the United States settled in California. And by the year 1990, about a third of all immigrants in the US lived in California. That's what that leftmost bar shows you. But as you move forward in time, this is the share of all immigrants in the United States who live in California. That's gone down to about 22, 23%. So from fully a third to much less than a quarter and continuing to decline. What's going on? Immigrants are settling in other parts of the country, and it's been change that's been unexpected. This shows you the share of the foreign born in the United States. That's the purple line. And then also the share in South Carolina, the gray line, and in Columbia, South to your metropolitan area. And you could see here that while the share of foreign born definitely lags the United States, it's actually seen a pretty sharp increase. And so one thing that we know is that sometimes people's reaction, fear around changing demography occurs when there's a big rapid change, and immigration is an important part of that. Part of what that's meant is that, like a lot of other places in the United States, there's now a fair share of mixed status families in South Carolina. This shows you the left-hand bar, the number of undocumented immigrants in South Carolina. It's about 87,000. But what is really interesting is that that number of undocumented immigrants is actually outnumbered by US citizen family members living with them or lawful residents, green card holders, refugees, etc., living with them. And so we've got a situation in which we have a lot, this is actually a little bit more pronounced in other parts of the country, a lot of mixed status families. You can see here how the demographic change has taken place geographically in the country in 1980. These are maps I showed last year too that show that the darker the shade here, the higher the percent people of color, meaning Black, Latino, Asian, Native American. And you could see here there was the Black Belt of the South. You're part of that. You could see the borderlands of Texas with Mexico, Native American and Hispanic areas of New Mexico and Arizona. You could see the Native American areas of the Dakotas. But California was actually not anywhere near majority people of color in 1980. That change occurred very rapidly in the next decade. And we move to the current census. You can see here lots of change, but a lot of it in California, in the Sun Belt, more in Texas, more in Arizona, New Mexico, some shifts and broadening of the Black Belt to the South, particularly as Black Northerners have returned to parts of the South, Atlanta as a mecca, but also places in North and South Carolina. But what you can see as you move forward is an even deepening presence of that throughout the South. And another way to take a look at that, next slide, is to look in particular at the Latino population. And what's fascinating to me about this is if you look at where Latinos live, all Latinos in the United States, by state and region in 1990, you could see that about 35% lived in California, about 20% in Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, places people would think about as Latino areas. Arizona, New Mexico, a little bit less. If you could go back. But in the South in 1990, it housed only about 3.6% of all the country's Latinos, 1990. Next slide. You could see that the share of Latinos in the South is now fully a tenth of all Latinos in the United States, and much more shrinkage in California. What's going on? Well, the South has had economic growth that's attracted Latinos and others to come there. There's also been a movement from other states. High cost states like California and New York have seen people migrating to other states. And these are new presences in the context of an already existing black-white dynamic within South Carolina. Most of the change in our youth population is now coming from, you can see here, the Latino and AAPI population. This is the United States as a whole. The youth population that's white has actually been on the decline. The youth population that's black on the decline, although a large share of that is young black people who, even in the past, even if they were mixed race, would mark themselves as black only, who are now more marking themselves as mixed race. But these are big changes, and this is the future, and part of that future is occurring in South Carolina. And you can see some of this also by looking at the median age of the population, half older, half younger for the US and South Carolina. And again, this is the most up-to-date data available. What you can see here is the big disparities in the age profile, in particular between the white population, where median age, half older, half younger, is 44 nationwide and in South Carolina. The Latino population, the median age in the United States is 30, but in South Carolina, it's 27. So a lot younger, a lot more young families, a lot more kids in school. Black population, somewhere in the middle in terms of the age structure. So lots of demographic change, which always tends to be unsettling for populations and creates the conditions for the kinds of political polarization and divisiveness that we've seen in the country. But adding on to that has been economic drivers. First, the growing income inequality in the country. In particular, looking at the blue line here, this is the share of national income going to the top 1%. And one of the things that you can see, I'll linger on this slide for a couple minutes, Chris, is you can see the share of income going to the top 1% since the late 1970s, moving into 1980, Reagan administration, Clinton administration, neoliberal economic policies, et cetera, big shift where the 1% has really run away from the rest of us, where the 1% used to get about 10% of national income. Now it's dipped a little bit probably in the last year, but about a quarter of national income going to the top 1%. There's also been a slight uptick in what's going to the top 1 to 5%, top 5 to 10% professional middle class people who are often hoarding opportunities, meaning that they might be in better neighborhoods, their kids might be going to quote unquote better schools. They're seeking to make sure that those opportunities are protected for them, even as they're seeing the 1% run away. And so you're seeing increasing class divisions between the educated and less educated, between the 1% and the rest. Again, a time of polarization and division. Next slide. Against that backdrop, South Carolina has done relatively well on job creation, somewhat outpacing the country. What it has not done well on, next slide, is the distributional measures. Here, the gray bars are the United States, the orange bars are South Carolina. This is the share, this is changes in income for full-time year-round workers, people who've got a job working year-long, year-round, more than 35 hours a week. As you can see at the 90th percentile, 10% make more, 90% make less. People have been doing pretty well. At the 80th percentile, people have been doing pretty well. South Carolina, a little bit distinct from the rest of the country. The median household, median worker has been doing okay as well. Not so much at the bottom of the wage distribution, a little bit better than the rest of the country, but growing wage disparities. And those wage disparities, next slide, have a pronounced difference by race. So you can see here some improvement in terms of the share of families living below 150% of the 150% of the poverty level. For Black families, slight improvement for white families, a big uptick for the Latino families that have moved in to South Carolina. But you could see these big disparities where Black and Latino poverty rates are 3 times what they are for white families. And so that's another dimension of division and polarization, of seeing other people's experience as distinct from your own. Now, there's a couple of things that factor into that I think are key. One, of course, is education. And this is a slide showing you educational profiles for South Carolina working age adults. This is called prime working age, between 25 and 64. Now that I'm 68, I think prime working age is up to about 75, but I'm sticking with the definitions from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Darn them. So prime working age, and you could see here that very different educational profiles, with the white population in South Carolina having about 36% of prime working age adults with a college degree. That's less than 20% for the Black population, about 20% for the Latino population. The Latino population has a very high share of people with less than a high school degree. A lot of those are very recent immigrants. The Asian population, super highly educated in your state. The other thing that factors into the economic experience is very different family formation patterns. And the thing to highlight here is that in contrast to the white, Latino, and AAPI populations, the Black South Carolina population has a very high share of single parent households. About 60% of all households who have what we call a first five population meaning that they have kids between the ages of 0 and 5. 60% of those parents of those households with those kids, um, I'm sorry, are in households that are headed by a single person, usually female. What if we delve deeply into the statistics, and we will in February, what you'll find is that most of those women are actually working, but they're not working at jobs that pay well. And as a result, kids are in desperate economic shape. Next slide. And the last of my data slides. And then we're going to get to Chris, who would normally do the data and have the boring job. But today he gets to do all the poetry, and a little bit resentful of that. But, it's the way it works out after 25 years. So the other thing to realize is that while South Carolina has been having a well-deserved job boom, and a lot of it in better, higher paying jobs, as you've attracted more finance and other higher paying industries, that doesn't always benefit South Carolinians. So if you look at the population in South Carolina, again, prime working age adults, and you ask the question of those who were born in state, how many have a college degree? That's about 22%. If you ask for people living in South Carolina, prime working age, who are born in another state, who has a college degree, it's about 40%. So about twice as many in terms of a share of out-of-staters living in South Carolina have a college degree. So to the extent that you're generating these jobs that are high paying, they're not necessarily going to people who grew up in the state, who have suffered through the times when South Carolina was not doing so well. And one of the key things to address is, how do you devise strategies that really work for the homegrown? And fortunately, that is what Chris is going to talk about. The one message I want to leave you with is that this division and polarization, as upsetting as they might be from the point of view of nonprofits and civil society, what Chris is going to suggest to you, and what I will as well, is that it's actually also not good for economic prosperity in the long haul. And so the really key thing is to wed together an inclusion and fairness argument with a prosperity and sort of job and income sustainability argument. Chris.
And, Manuel was joking about him presenting the data today and me getting to do the poetry. I forgot to emphasize at the very beginning, I'm an economic geographer, which is really economics as if people in place matter. And economists, y'all know the kind of person who becomes an economist is someone who's really good at math, but doesn't have an engaging enough personality to be an accountant. Present company excluded. Manuel is one of the exceptional economists that really does pay attention to people and place. And I want to talk a little bit, before we get into the poetry of solidarity economics, to talk a little bit about when and how do paradigms change. And Manuel emphasized that we really started seeing the 1% taking off away from the rest of us right about the time that neoliberalism came in as a dominant paradigm in the leadership of this country in the 1980s. But those ideas were percolating around since at least the early 1960s. Milton Friedman wrote his book, Capitalism and Freedom, in 1962, in which he talked about it's only a crisis, whether actual or perceived, that produces real change. And when that crisis comes, those ideas lying around become the alternatives for existing policies. And really, our idea during this time is to keep these ideas alive until what seems politically impossible actually becomes politically inevitable. And our hope is that we don't have to wait another 20 years until we actually see the importance of mutuality. This book, Solidarity Economics, was our 5th book, and as I mentioned, built on a number of previous books that were really looking at the role of mutuality and equity in economic growth. And you can see with the table of context, we talk a bit about it in the context of innovation, social support, also about our environment. There's a website, solidarityeconomics.org, where we also have videos. There's a comic book for Solidarity Economics that is in both English and Spanish. We're developing training materials for community-based organizations through a number of different initiatives. We're really trying to help spread these ideas far, far beyond the academy. The book is actually available free to download off of that website, part of our solidarity with our readers. But there's really 3 central points we hope you'll take away from the work and the ideas. And one is that we should always talk about our economy, not the economy. And it's a reminder that economies don't exist in nature, markets aren't created and following fundamental laws of physics and chemistry. No, they're created by people. They follow laws and regulations that we set up. And it's a reminder that the micro foundations of our economy are built by people's day-to-day activities as much as they are by laws and regulations. And we talk about this in the book, that this modification of a saying that's attributed to the Cherokee Nation of, if we have 2 wolves inside of us, one self-interested and one that cares for others, then the wolf we feed is the one that thrives. And neoliberalism emphasizes individualism, it emphasizes competition, and markets create selfish people. And part of what we're trying to do is recognize those places in our economy where people do things like tip that show a caring for others that isn't about a price-based relationship, assuming you'll get better service, because of course the tip comes after the service. And in most cases, you never see the same server again. And yet many of us do tip. And there are many, many places where we see that people care in our economy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But that brings us to this second point, which is that we should recognize that mutuality actually drives our current economy. And that in those places that invest in equity actually do better economically, not just socially. My favorite example of this, because I'm a sports fan, is all of our major sports leagues at the moment have revenue sharing agreements where the teams in the largest media markets have to share some of their revenue with the other teams. There are salary caps that you can't go above. And the teams that do the worst each year get to draft the best talent in the next round. They have all realized that reducing inequality produces a better economic product. But actually, they didn't get there until the players' unions organized and helped negotiate those agreements to help the individual team owners see their collective self-interest. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this chart here about what derails sustained growth when I talk about our previous book. But there's lots of evidence that shows that those places, those metropolitan regions, those countries that are more equitable do better economically. And even at a company level, we can see the ways that neoliberal training, in this case, where CEOs with a business degree take over from a previous CEO without a business degree. There's a decline in the amount that goes to workers in the company, but no increase in employment, investment, or productivity. We have trained our business leaders to be maximizing profitability in a neoliberal framework that actually doesn't do better for us economically, but actually increases inequality, which undermines prosperity. And that's part of why we emphasize that not only do we need to recognize the importance of mutuality in our current economy, but we need to invest in that, invest in those organizations and social movements that can help us see our commonality and connection and get beyond this profound sense of disconnection that really drives the polarization in our society. And One of the books where we really emphasize this, which was our fourth book together, is Equity, Growth, and Community. And I'll talk about that in a second. But first, what do we see differently in our economy with the solidarity economics frame, with the frame that recognizes that care, collaboration, cooperation is as important as competition in driving economic prosperity? Well, one thing we might see is actually the importance of the care economy. This chart in orange shows total employment in California, the high-tech capital of the country. But the orange is employment in care industries: nursing, elder care, family care, home health care, child care services, which is substantially more than in high-tech services and growing more rapidly. And part of that is because our aging demographic. Actually, part of that is a recognition in California of the importance of investing in early childhood education, which has economic payoffs 20 years down the road in higher graduation rates and college-bound rates, higher productivity in the labor market. But recognizing that importance of a care economy requires us to really challenge what counts as skilled labor. We actually know how to train people to write algorithms for AI. It's actually very hard to train people to be quality early childhood educators and to know how to recognize that and reward it in a way that can be seen in the labor market. And we need to really address the low public funding and support for those care occupations and care industries. Another thing we might see is how our entire health system is focused on treating illness rather than promoting health. And we all do worse because of that, because we don't invest enough in those social determinants of health, those things that are really upstream root causes of diseases that we end up treating down the road. But to get there, we'd also need to build the people who can see those connections and mutuality while challenging the undue influence of the medical establishment and the lack of investment in our public health infrastructure. And we might also see the importance of recognizing that going green is good economics. And each year that we postpone moving to a fully carbon-free economy has a huge economic cost. What this chart shows is year by year by year, the number of disaster events that cause at least $1 billion of damage in the country. And you can see how much that is growing up. And that has huge racial inequality dimensions of it as well. There's research that shows that those places in the country that have higher racial inequality in exposure to environmental pollution actually have higher environmental pollution overall for non-Hispanic white populations as well as populations of color. And finally, the other thing we might see with the solidarity economics frame is the difference between a safety net, which has this notion of catching people through the result of, if they need help through an accident or some misfortune, but one doesn't address the structural causes that cause such high levels of poverty and inequality in our society, and also doesn't recognize the ways that even unpaid labor is an important part of promoting our economy, and the ways that, in many ways, the natural resources of our country should be a collective inheritance that we all benefit from in some way. And imagine, again, the high-tech industry in California, which in its early stages depended tremendously on public sector investment in major technological advances, and even new industries. The electric vehicle industry, which is what our sixth book is about, has been really created by public regulations. And imagine if the benefits from that, instead of going to the top 1%, were invested in communities around the country who were being threatened by economic restructuring associated with that technological change. So coming back to that chart, and this is the Equity, Growth, and Community book that I want to really lift up, is that this was a study that was looking at the largest 200 metropolitan regions in the country and really trying to understand, well, what helps explain success in those places that were able to invest in equity and promote economic prosperity and have growth and equity go together. What helps explain that? And part of what we saw is that the places that were not able to achieve sustained equitable growth, there were four major factors that really helped explain that. One, and the most important, was the level of income inequality at the beginning of this economic period was highly associated with falling into recessions much sooner than regions that had less inequality. So less inequality regions were more resilient to economic downturns. Regions that had more racial segregation were also more vulnerable. And regions that were more fragmented in terms of their local government structure, less integrated, were also more vulnerable. And finally, we looked at whether there was predominantly Republican or predominantly Democratic regions, whether that was at all associated with these measures of economic success. And there was no correlation. But what was correlated was the level of political fragmentation, the political sorting. In other words, the disparity in voting patterns between central cities, essentially, and their surrounding suburbs, surrounding counties, to the best we could measure that. Those places that had more disparity in those voting patterns were less resilient to economic downturns. But because we actually care about people and place, we went and talked to folks, which is what many economists don't do. And so we did deep case studies of 11 different regions and found that this notion of knowing together, really building what we call knowledge communities or epistemic communities, is a really important part of getting to that successful economic trajectory, which is not to say that there isn't conflict, because conflict emerged in nearly all of these cases, but that people had a sense of common destiny in these regions and were willing to work through conflict to get to a point of collaboration and working together despite the differences. And so that's what we call these diverse and dynamic epistemic communities that have that sense of broad inclusion, a common regional destiny that's built on repeated interactions and long-term work together. We talk about the new 3 R's. It's not reading, writing, arithmetic, but roots, a common sense of roots in the region, and face-to-face relationships and communication that can build ties across race, across city and suburbs, and across ideological differences, driven by the 3rd R, which is reason, a commitment to data-driven decision-making and facts-based work. And that takes investment over time, where we talk about it doesn't just happen by chance. Talk is not actually cheap. It requires effort, but it really can help change hearts and minds in ways that encourage collaboration rather than zero-sum competition. We could regale you with stories from those 11 regions, and I'll just highlight a couple of them, but we can get back to that more in the Q&A. But one example is Kansas City. It's actually a bi-state metropolitan region with some 9 counties. And there you have a regional planning organization, the Mid-America Regional Council, that all metropolitan regions in the country have, but in most places are focused just on transportation. In Kansas City, they focus on everything from early childhood education to services for the elderly, to actually international trade was part of what they had for a while, environmental service, economic development, environmental services, driven by an economic data-driven Metro Outlook Live dashboard. Salt Lake City was another place. Here you had the Mormon Church was actually a really important institution, of course, in Salt Lake. But there, the structure of the church is such that major business and political leaders often serve 3 to 5 years, sometimes more, as the leader of their local church body. And as part of that, really get experience as social workers of administering a provident fund for poor people in their communities. And there you have a small nonprofit organization, Envision Utah, which helped bring together planning organizations in the region similarly. Oklahoma City, again, when you let data drive your case studies, you come up with places that you wouldn't expect. Oklahoma City is a place that has a large city government that can bring together both poor and wealthy areas under a single tax base and use that to reinvest some of the wealth in some neighborhoods into investment in the other area of the city. But again, they had a program here called MAPS, the Metropolitan Area Projects, that would bring together in one package 9 different major public investments serving a variety of different interests within the city, much of it focused on downtown revitalization. And here the intergenerational solidarity was really important because the mayor driving this at the time in appealing to folks in the suburb who, we understood maybe didn't spend that much time downtown, but said, we're building the city that your children are going to want to live in rather than migrating away to that horrible place, California, which was the sentiment at the time. And I'll turn it to Manuel to talk about one of the other last places and then to wrap us up and get to your questions. Manuel, back to you.
Let me quick about this one thing that's quite interesting about the San Antonio case. And again, this is all a little bit of a taste of things that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail when we're with you in person, is that this is a location that is now currently celebrated as a paragon of collaboration between business and community, between government and community. And yet, if you go back 30, 40 years ago, everyone was at each other's throats. Lots of conflicts between business leaders, community and labor leaders, government that wasn't very representative, but controlled by a very thin elite. And yet, they went through a process of learning how to conflict productively. So we often talk about collaboration as principled conflict. If you're collaborating with people you already agree with, you're just hanging around with your friends. But collaboration is principled conflict, where you have some principles you share, a better San Antonio. You got some principles about how you will conflict with integrity, with respect for other people, etc. And those inform you being able to find your way to common ground. So a couple of takeaways for us. First, on what we might think of as guiding principles. We think that too often in the United States, the debate is between market and state. With some people saying there's a problem, how do we solve it? The market. Too little housing, we need the market. Racial discrimination, the market will compete it away. A lot of others think it's the government. Too little housing, the government should build more. Racial discrimination, the government should intervene, and it probably should. But the real question is, how do we turn it to an answer where the mental default is us? If we've got a problem, how do we turn to each other and build that mutuality and collaboration? In that spirit, how do we consider or center race and still find common ground? And then how do we think about economic development in a way that thinks about economic alternatives, but also thinks creatively a better role for business at every size level, from large corporations to small business? Next slide. So when that gets to specific approaches for the nonprofit sector to consider, some of it's about community wealth building, land trusts, co-ops, things that help wealth stay in a community. Some of it's about anchor institutions, hospitals, educational institutions, etc. How can they contract locally with small business, help develop communities? So some of that's what we think of as solidarity economics, what some people call a solidarity economy of co-ops, small enterprises. But we know that for some of our biggest problems of the day, climate and the energy transition, manufacturing, keeping an edge in technology. We need large corporations that can amass the technology and capital at scale to deal with the problems we've got. And so, how do we develop an understanding, appreciation, and support for high road businesses that reinvest in communities? And how do we build strategies that bridge between groups and geographies that make business leaders recognize the importance of equity and inclusion to prosperity, that make community leaders recognize the importance of private investment and projects penciling out to what might be termed justice, that make people in a metropolitan region or a state, as Chris was saying, understand face to face, race to race, place to place, that our destinies are actually interwoven and that we can use data to guide us. We can use deliberation or conversation to find commonalities, but we also need to generate a sense of common destiny. And with that, let's turn things over to JP to let us know what, oh, no good talk goes without an advertisement. These are our most recent books. Charging Forward, the most recent. About every book I've ever written, I've always said it's about to be made into a major motion picture. Charging Forward is the only one that actually is. There's two documentaries being made that accompany the book, so stay tuned. This thing might win an Oscar. GP.
Thank you all so much, Dr. Benner and Dr. Pastor. That was really great. It helped me kind of bring back some of the memories from your session this year, but with a lot of new South Carolina data and some really good thoughts. I had a lot of things to chew on this, but I have a question for you that I want to kick off with, and then folks feel free to add more in the chat. But I've got a couple. Particularly, you had the slide about homegrown educational attainment, and I thought that was very interesting. I'll just ask the question the way I worded it. What impact do you think? I know you don't have it in front of you, but impact do you think South Carolina's economic history will have on our economic future? Because thinking about your homegrown educational attainment slide, I imagine, without having the data, it would mirror pretty well with our textile heavy past. And we're moving into a lot of growth in the manufacturing sector with a lot of focus on workforce training at the high school level and helping fill those jobs that we're creating that are very well paying, that have a good trajectory to them. But you talk about how do you parse those two together a little bit, or talk a little bit about that?
Well, first, let me just say that the recruitment of manufacturing and the creation of job pathways to those jobs is very important because it gives hope to people who do not have a college degree that they can find their way to sustainable livelihoods for themselves and their families. So you're to be applauded for that. And of course, integrating the community college system and workforce development, absolutely key. I think one of the things, though, is that when you start to think about other higher end, and it's a little bit clearer, for example, and I mean, you are not the only area where what's going on is that the jobs being generated that are the most highly paid are actually benefiting people from out of state. That's happening in steroids in Atlanta, where it's a black mecca. It's brought a lot of black people there, but from the north who are highly educated, who are getting the good jobs, and a lot of the local Atlantans are not benefiting. It's happening in Denver, Colorado, which by every metric looks like it's doing really well, But the reason it's doing really well is out-of-staters who want to ski, who move there and take the really good jobs. That's also true in Seattle, where a lot of the local populations haven't benefited from the tech boom there. People coming in for the Amazon jobs, for the Microsoft jobs, have moved in from out of state. So you're not alone in that, but it's a caution that you should. And we just did a study of St. Louis, where when you're there in person, you see it. You go from a neighborhood where houses are $35,000 to a neighborhood 2 miles away where houses are 2 million. And you know, it's not a lot of local people who bought up to $2 million houses, but they've had a really successful ads and med strategy. Particularly, they've got a really powerful medical establishment. People come from out of town to get advanced healthcare there. There's lots of great research, but it's not clear that it's benefiting people who grew up in St. Louis. So that's a bit of a warning flag that you don't want to pay attention just to the shiny new objects, but to the economic drivers that actually work for your community. Chris, I know you have a lot to say about these kinds of things.
Well, the one other thing I'd add is, we often used to talk about in distressed economies, the problem of the brain drain, where, young populations would leave to other economic circumstances. And part of, what we're seeing of out-of-staters coming into these new opportunities is, I don't know what the opposite of brain drain is, but I think it's really important for us to be thinking much more about brain circulation. And it's part of what we see a lot in the South is people who, maybe a generation or two previously, someone had left the South to opportunities in the North, and now moving back to be close to extended family, extended kin. So I don't want it to get us into this situation of like, oh, it's problematic that outsiders, quote, are coming back to South Carolina and other places in the South, because that can be a really important economic driver, and people who often have long-term deep roots in the region, just not in their own life or upbringing. And that creates, important social networks and ties to opportunity in other places as well. So I think that's important. And even people who don't have those kind of roots, can be coming in, and we can help build ties to other parts of the country that can lead to economic investment as well.
Thank you so much. The other one that I had, well, Karen, you want to go ahead and ask your question on this front, and I'll put you on the spot.
Just to sort of piggyback on that, Dr. Benner and Dr. Pastor, one of the concerns that we've seen living on the coast, so when you look at Myrtle Beach and Charleston and Hilton Head, that's our tourism economy for the state, which has always been plagued with low-paying jobs in the hotel and restaurant industry. So it's always been very, very difficult for people to make a living wage. But now we've got such a huge influx of population, as you noted, coming from out of state, principally from New York and New England, Ohio, New Jersey, but they are 65 plus. And they are not interested in working. So South Carolina right now has one of the lowest work participation rates. Even though our unemployment rate is low, our participation rate is very, very scary. These folks are not interested in producing anything and being part of the economy. They are consumers. They're true consumers. So they want to go out to those restaurants and eat. They want to shop. They want to enjoy the climate, but they're not actually in the economy. And I'm just curious if you've seen other communities or other states where this phenomena has already happened, because it is very, very challenging, again, to fill the open jobs. And again, I think we're hitting almost a tipping point with such a high influx of folks coming into the state that are not participating in the manufacturing sector or the tech sector or the healthcare sector or the agricultural sector, which are, our four biggest sectors here in South Carolina. So I'm just curious about what you've seen, and maybe that's something we can explore a little bit more at the summit in February.
Great to lift up these issues before the summit so we can think more about them, but just briefly, yeah, where has this happened before? And to bad effect, Arizona. Um, but it has the following effects that people don't consider. First, in general, there's a challenge with, for example, sufficient spending on schools when there's a big, particularly racial difference between those who are older and retired and those who are younger and the future of the workforce. That is, you find where there's a bigger racial generation gap, that there's less investment in the success of the next generation because people who are older don't see themselves in the next generation. Now, the way you resolve that is not by changing the generations, but exactly through the bridging that I was talking about. How do you bring people together in faith communities? I've always been a big proponent of engaging older adults in naturalization ceremonies because I think it kind of opens people's minds to the aspirations of immigrants, and they also begin to realize how difficult it is to pass the civics test and uh, develop a deeper appreciation for that. But this problem is particularly exacerbated when the older folks not only have a generational racial difference, but also didn't even grow up in the place and don't necessarily care about its future. So I think it exacerbates problems of the political will to make investments in the next generation to support a nonprofit sector that addresses these questions. The other thing it does structurally, which is a bit of a challenge too, is that they do not, you're right, they're not working. But also, if you think about what they want to spend money on, it's not manufactured goods, it's not high-tech products, it's low-end services. And they want the restaurants and the house cleaners and the elder care and the janitors to make as little as possible because it lowers their burden on fixed income. So it generates a lot of demand for poorly paid service work without a full realization, which is what Chris was trying to lift up. They will do better when those service workers do better. It'll be better service, etc. But I think it's a challenge when somebody moves in with a fixed income. What they're looking for is the cheapest possible set of services.
The one little thing I'd add to that in terms of things that can help people see the importance of those intergenerational and often interracial racial connections is, in part, the health of our Social Security system is going to be based on both the number and the wages of newcomers in those service sector industries. And so actually, in terms of supporting that system overall, we do need to be raising wages in the lower wage service sector. We can talk a lot about Social Security, and it's really the growing inequality in our country that has undermined, to an extent, not the extent to which it's often talked about, but to some extent, the viability of that system long term. And reducing that inequality is a huge part of shoring up Social Security.
Thank you. Related to that a little, you had your 3 R's: the roots, relationships, and reason. And I'm curious if, I know that study was sort of 11, the metro areas, so a little bit bigger. We have a couple of those in South Carolina, but the vast majority of South Carolina cities out of 271 are populations under 1,000, for instance. I'm curious if there's they're all 3 are very important, I think, all a part of the picture. Are there some that have different initial tractions than the other based on how the communities are? I think of a rural small town, and I live in one, and roots are extremely important, but also so are relationships. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on which one usually gets traction first sometimes.
Maybe I'll start this time. And part of that is because even with that last question, I'm very aware of the region in which I live, the Monterey Bay, has on the coastal areas, Monterey Peninsula, Monterey City, and Santa Cruz, very predominantly white communities, large retirement community, particularly in Monterey, but a workforce that is predominantly rural, living in the Salinas Valley, place that is 25% agriculture in terms of employment, and predominantly Latino, large immigrant population in the space of about 20 miles. And 95% of the workforce of Monterey City don't live in the city, despite contributing to the tax base of the city and the sales tax and the hotel occupancy, transient occupancy tax. But they can only afford to live in Salinas and other small rural towns, agricultural towns nearby. And so we face this challenge of how do we help people see a common destiny across those areas. And it's definitely this sense of, I'd say, two things. Roots in the region, and even newcomers to the Monterey Peninsula, like they would love to, live there for a long period of time. And many of them would actually love to have their children live nearby. And so the high cost of housing is really important to address across both those populations. And part of that is also then the educational system, that we have a tremendously high turnover of teachers in the Monterey School District because they can't afford to live in that area. And so it makes real challenges for raising kids in Monterey itself. But then, of course, the workforce is predominantly Latino in the service sector industry and healthcare industries overall. So I would say that the roots is the thing that first drives people, and then the data and reason, I would say, is second. That is how you begin to get people talking. When you have data about the region that's separated from which party do you prefer and which election are we working towards, but really about our long-term roots in this region, then that can become the basis for relationships. Relationships are often the most difficult because you're really trying to bridge divided communities and divided places, and that's where the data can be really valuable in doing that.
So quick answer to that, which is cheating, which is that you need all three. And I say that because I think the entry point for a lot of business people is around the data. And it's one of the reasons why we included in our presentation is this is what we're talking about. These are challenges. There can be multiple ways to deal with that. But if we agree on what the facts are, then we're going to have some respectful disagreements about the strategies. I think that the data can be used to build a relationship. And I think where that's important is that if you don't have a full sense of what another community or group is experiencing, which you really get from a relationship, then the data is just a bunch of numbers, and it's easy to blame people for the circumstances they're in, or to think that you're remarkably gifted because you're doing well, instead of understanding they're but for the grace of God and that we should be together. The word that I think that we would also lift up besides roots, relationships, and reason is scaling. Because the goal is not for a small town to deeply understand its own situation, but for it to see how it fits into the larger metro area, for the metro areas, rural and urban areas, to see how they're all part of the state, and eventually for all of our states to see how we're part of a common union. So Chris and I actually, if you go all the way back to the 25 years, started doing a lot of regional work. It wasn't because we were nerds around regions, although we weren't. He's a geographer. I thought it was fascinating. But because we thought, again, that places where people got to know one another and saw common fate was a way that you could scale up to deal with the bigger divisions, polarization, lack of a common direction that plagues the United States.
Thank you. That's very relevant to some other conversations I've had recently wearing other hats. That's really great. I have one more for you on my end. It's a data point, and I guess it's a little biased question of my favorite data point and what it might mean for you. When I look at communities one of my favorite data points is median age trends. Because to your point about roots, if you have a growing percentage of census population under age of 5, you're likely having more families who are likely hopefully staying longer, blah, blah, blah. I have not broken that down in my head across racial demographics, but I know you talked about that a little bit on one of your slides about South Carolina's median age of the Latino population, for instance. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are. What do you see when you look at median age trends? What are you looking for that shows upward trajectory in some of the areas? Maybe not, I don't know if it affects all the areas you pay attention to, but some of the areas.
Well, I'll tell you something from California, which I think is a harbinger of what's going on for the rest of the country, which is that if you look at the median age going forward from the current moment to 2060, we have in our minds a mental map that we've got an older, older population, a younger, more diverse population. But what we forget is that every year, Latinos and Asians also become 1 year older. And if you look at the median age going forward in California, the median age for whites is going to stay about the same for the next 40 years. For Black folks, it's going up. For Asians, a little bit more steeply going up. For Latinos, a little more steeply going up. I know there's a lot of heat around immigration, but immigration really actually slowed down into the United States. The immigrants are getting longer settled. Their family formation patterns are getting more like the US norm of just having 2 kids. Everyone is aging. And what that means, I mean, the fun thing I love about demography is everything you think you know from the past is not the future. And to me, that there's a really important imperative, which is that if we know that the aging populations are probably going to be Black and Latino compared to white, who are already old and will still be old, we better do something about the racial wealth gap now, because you really don't want people retiring with the level of the lack of assets that is so typical of Black and Latino families. If you've got investments to make in schools, you really don't want this next generation, which is more kids of color, a lot of low income kids, to not get a good education, because there's going to be a lot more older people generally, and they're going to need to contribute a lot more to Social Security, Medicare, and basically just general productivity for us to be able to survive as we, people like me, get a little bit older and expect a decent lifestyle. So to me, what's interesting is that it's the aging of the population that's lighting a fire under me to say we need to deal with racial inequality and the racial wealth gap now so that we're better situated for a more harmonious future going forward.
Dr. Bennett, do you have anything?
That was so articulate, I hesitate to try and say anything. But the thing that was on my mind is really 2 things. One is on the education field, and really, one of the elements of that racial inequality is that we have a situation where in many school districts, at least in California, I don't know if it's the same in South Carolina, where you have a student body that has more people of color than teachers. And we know that role models and students being able to see someone like themselves in a teacher role is a really important part of success in school. So again, it's pointing to that racial equity in employment patterns, as well as in educational outcomes. But then the second thing is, our student body at UC Santa Cruz, it's about 65%, 70% students of color right now, with tremendous experience and connections across the globe, actually, a lot of immigrant students. And I learn something new from them every day as a professor. And part of that is just embracing the wisdom and life experience of that younger generation is something that I find really exciting, and seeing that racial shift in our student body as something really exciting.
The other demographic trend to be paying attention to also is the increasing sense of separation between rural and urban America. And I think the way in which, I mean, there's also this stereotype that rural communities are all white. And as you know, South Carolina and elsewhere, you've got rural communities that are white and black, but, and now increasingly Latino, but those communities do feel like they're not part of the economic mainstream. Often they are aging in place, particularly the white and black communities, uh, because their kids, if they get an opportunity, go elsewhere and don't necessarily come back because they don't sense opportunities at home. And that sense of being left out of the future is also a recipe for polarization and division.
So great points. And personally, I'd love to see a map of South Carolina's median age trends and racial demographics part of it. Mostly for personal curiosity of understanding, Karen, to your point, the growth in this state. And as Dr. Pastor, you highlighted even this past summit, that growth is impacting different communities differently. South Carolina is the fastest growing state in the nation this year. But that median age growth is, is separate from the workforce conversation in many ways. But where are those communities that are growing with all of our populations in those areas? This is not the point of today's conversation, though. It's something I'm really diving into personally, but I don't have any other questions that were sent to me. And we've had a really great conversation. And Dr. Pastor and I talked about making sure we ended early as a goal of all of our presentations we do. That's something him and I share in common. And we want to be sure folks can get to, for me, a tree lighting in about 15, 20 minutes. And others. Dr. Benner and Dr. Pastor, thank you so much for your time today, for offering this pre-summit keynote. We all look forward to hearing you and seeing you in person in February at our summit. You can visit togethersc.org/summit to register. And this recording will be made available. So if you want to watch it again before the summit to kind of prep your brain again, because this is not the presentation you will see in February. You may see some kind of reminders, but this is a really great way to kind of get your brain jogged for as you drive to the summit. You can listen to it on your car ride there. Thank you all so much for being here today, and I look forward to seeing everyone in February.
Thanks, everybody.